But with that being said, Zach, just let me know that Congresswoman Elise Stefanik is on the line. Good morning.
Good morning, Dave. Thanks for having me.
Guy, I'm one of your fans. I'm so proud to have you on.
It's my honor. I have to tell you, I've listened to the show before. Sometimes on Saturday mornings when we have a free morning,
Sure.
I drive and take my son to visit his grandmother, and we always listen to WGY. So I've heard this show the last couple of weeks.
Well, that's great. That's great. Matter of fact, you just dropped the surprise. I was going to say congratulations to you. You got a big day coming up. You're going to have a 1-year-old baby boy pretty soon.
Yes, that will be the end of the summer.
Yeah.
It's amazing how fast it goes. He turned 8 months this past week. So, our life has changed so much for the better. I started my morning this morning building blocks with him so he could knock down in his little bedroom.
Is he a sleeper?
He's a good sleeper. I hear stories from other parents. He's a very good sleeper, so we're lucky.
Yeah, good for you. Good for you. Well, thank you again. Like I said, it's I want to tip my hat to Palmer. She is wonderful. We've had a lot of integration with her, and keep her on your staff because she's a winner.
That's great. Yeah, thank you. I know our schedule can be hectic,
yeah.
So appreciate your flexibility.
Well, that's fine. Listen, let's get into it because I know that there's a lot of people that want to hear your opinion and some of the topics that we're going to talk a little bit about. I guess the first one that I want to get into of course, the name of the show kind of tells you a little bit about what we do as far as pre- and post-retirement planning. I know that you're very involved in what's going on with Social Security and Medicare, but that's a common theme that I hear over and over and over again with prospective clients. I'm worried about Social Security if it's going to be there. What can you enlighten us about Social Security if you can?
Absolutely. So in my district, I actually represent one of the highest numbers of seniors out of any congressional district in the country. So we really work on a daily basis with our seniors, with the challenges of Social Security, with Medicare. We've recovered over $3 million in Social Security and Medicare benefits for our seniors. So that's been nearly 1,000 cases. So that's when a constituent reaches out and they've had challenges with either of those agencies getting access to their benefits. The concern that I hear most is making sure that those programs are available for future generations. And unfortunately, the Social Security Trust Fund, it's going to be in dire straits in 2033. That's not that long away. Yeah. And we need to make sure that those programs, which are so important, are there for future generations. The other challenge that I hear from seniors, and it's very much tied to Social Security, is the crushing cost of inflation. Mm-hmm. And Social Security benefits received a 5.9% increase of January 2022. That's the largest cost of living adjustment since 1982, which just goes to show how much people, particularly our seniors, have been suffering under inflation. But my commitment is on Social Security and Medicare. We need to modernize those programs so they continue to exist. And that's certainly something when you talk to people who are my age, so we're not quite near retirement, we have a lot of working years left. We know that on the current trajectory, those programs aren't going to be there. We need to fix that, and it's going to take leadership. It's going to take leadership from both parties to be honest about the challenge ahead to make sure that we protect those important programs.
Yeah, you bring up a good topic here, and this is one of the things that I've talked about for years, that the Social Security program that's currently in place was designed for a life expectancy that was much less than what it is today. And also, I think it was designed for people that probably the chances of them getting it were slim to none based on life expectancy. So I guess there's my question to you. Why is it so difficult to modernize a program that really is not specific for today's generation? Meaning that, I've got clients that are in their late 80s and 90s that you would think that are in their 60s because of the quality of life that they have today, and bypass surgery and healthcare and not smoking and drinking and exercising. So you would think that it would be an easy fix, but why is it so difficult for people to come to the table and say this is a different time and age?
Well, one thing that I've learned many things since I was elected to office, but the sort of advocacy for the status quo is very powerful, not from constituents, not from the American people, but frankly from bureaucrats who don't want to see any changes made. Now, I've been very clear. I want to make sure that everyone is able to plan for their retirement. I don't want to see any changes for those at 50 or above. But for my generation, we know that those programs frankly aren't going to exist, and they're going to be bankrupt by the time we hit retirement. And you were right to point out that we do have a much longer life expectancy. The quality of life is much better when these programs were put into place. So that's going to be part of modernizing them, slowly raising the retirement age, which, you talk to seniors, many of them are working. I just introduced legislation focused on senior entrepreneurs because I represent thousands of seniors who are running their small businesses and as on the side, or maybe that's their full-time job, but that actually goes to add to Social Security benefits for them. So senior and retirement looks very different for this generation than it did even for 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And you asked why we can't come to a solution. I'll be honest with you, because Democrats refuse to engage in any discussion about how we can make improvements to this program and modernize it to fit the needs of the 21st century.
Well, New York State's a one-party system, which is, I think, a real negative for democracy. Washington right now is a one-party system where the House and the Senate and the White House is controlled. Do they basically control the time and the meetings and the topics and what's going to be discussed and not being? I mean, do you really have a seat at the table right now?
Well, I always work to make sure I have a seat at the table for my district. But we are seeing, and you see it in the policies, and you see how quickly the country has unraveled over the past year, that there are consequences to one-party far-left rule. And we see it double in New York State, out of Albany, and then out of Washington, D.C. So I'll give you a couple examples. Mm-hmm. I go around my district, inflation, which I touched upon. That's the number one issue I hear, the cost increase of goods. You go to the grocery store, the cost increases of energy, whether you're pumping gas or whether it's home heating bills. People are getting crushed. We have advocated that Democrats need to focus on this inflation crisis, and they have refused. Nancy Pelosi has not had a single piece of legislation to address inflation, to address supply chain, to address the labor shortage, all of these issues that I hear on a daily basis. Mm-hmm. The other thing that listeners should know is they run the House horribly. So just the functioning of Congress, the moving legislation through committees, making sure that we're getting our work done. For example, this past week, Friday, we were supposed to be in session. They sent members of Congress home early. There's too many problems in this country for us not to be using every legislative day to tackle these important issues, which is why, from my perspective, it's so important to win back the House for Republicans to address these multiple crises. We need to rein in the reckless tax and spending binge, frankly, that Joe Biden and House Democrats have been on, and live by the same rules as the rest of the American people, which is focus towards getting our budget to balance. I've voted for balanced budgets since I've been in Congress. Democrats have never put on the floor a budget that comes to balance. And when we're, again, when I'm talking to families, when I'm talking to constituents, I was just at an event last night at Saratoga County, people are getting fed up with this one-party rule. Mm-hmm. And then Albany, of course, is mismanagement on steroids. Mm-hmm. But people are waking up. It's not just Republicans, but Democrats and independents who have been very disappointed in what's happening in New York State and what's happening at the federal level. So I think it's going to be a big year for Republican candidates on the ballot.
Well, I just said earlier in the program, I spent a lot of time in Florida because we have so many clients down there, and my wife Julie and I were just down there. And, 1,000 people a day, Congresswoman, are moving to Florida. And a good bulk of them are coming from the New England region. Yeah, there are some from, Michigan and Wisconsin, et cetera. But I'm going to say, most of the people that I bumped into, I was on Lover's Key Island, and half the island were people from the Capital District region that are living down there now on a full-time basis. They come back, but they live down there like 8 months out of the year, 9 months out of the year. Do you have any idea? I've searched for information on this. What is the impact to New York State to have all these people say, I'm not living here anymore because it's just too expensive?
Well, it's a huge impact. It's an impact on our tax base. It's an impact on our quality of life. I will tell you that I've done events in Florida because so many New Yorkers, as you said, are down in Florida.
Yeah.
That includes many of my constituents. And it is also very sad to hear about our small businesses. Many small businesses are choosing to relocate elsewhere because it's just crushing the tax burden in New York State, the burdensome regulations. You know, my family, I grew up in my family's small business, and it is getting harder and harder in New York State to continue to keep up with the ridiculous policies. And it got worse under COVID. I mean, if you look at the management effectively of the COVID pandemic from an economic perspective, frankly, and a public health perspective from Florida, they did a much better job than New York State on virtually every metric. So it's very disappointing, but the impact is significant. I will tell you that in March, nearly 40%, according to a poll, of New Yorkers are considering or have already made plans to move out of state. So think about that. 40%, that's a lot of people. That would be millions of, tens of millions of tax revenue and millions of residents across the state. So we can't be in a situation where New York State continues to raise taxes forever, because we're just going to continue losing population. And we're a great state. You know, we have so much to be proud of, so many natural resources. We are the Empire State. I'm so proud to represent my district, but the sad part is that the supermajority of Democrats in Albany are just, they forget that it's small businesses and hardworking families that are the backbone of New York, not the government in Albany.
Well, you're singing to the choir on two of the bullet points that you just said. I'm a small business, so I know all of these taxes and all these things that you have to do, what I consider to be all the stuff that's underneath the hood that most of the employees don't see, that the small businessman also has to do. But the other part of it is, too, is that, one of the things that we try to do when we talk to individuals in the initial stage of them coming in is that, look out another 3 to 5 to 10 years. Where will your residence be? Because if you're doing estate planning, you need to know the state they're going to be in, right? Because every state is different as far as protecting assets. And your number, I'm going to say about 50% of the people say, I'm out of here. I'm not staying in New York. I don't know where I'm going yet, but I'm not staying here.
It's tragic.
I
was in the House Republicans had our annual we do a once a year working retreat to kind of lay out our agenda, to make sure all of our committees are focused on the issues that matter to the American people. And we did it in the state of Florida. And I visited prior to that with a few New Yorkers who are in Florida, and they just talked about over the past 10 years how much they've saved as a family living in Florida, running their business in Florida, rather than when they were in New York. And it's really, really tragic. I visit small businesses, I visit manufacturers all the time in my district, and I think back to when I first ran in 2014, there are so many small businesses that really were the anchor of main streets, the anchor of communities, that have closed up because it's not only was COVID challenging, but the challenges from a policy perspective of New York State are crushing. And people are feeling this on a real level, which is why, unfortunately, that number is so high of people considering relocating.
Yeah. Well, we spent a lot of time traveling and flying and driving and trains and planes, not because we necessarily want to, but we have to because our clients are no longer here in New York State. So I'm hoping and I'm praying that this ends. You can only tax people so much before they say that's it. That number that you just said is shocking to me. 40% of the population is going. There's millions of people that are just saying, I'm washing my hands, I'm moving out of this. And so, but enough said about that. Let's get into another topic that I hear all the time. How much bigger can this deficit be in Washington? I mean, it just seems like, it's another trillion here. It's no longer billions, it's trillions.
Yeah, I think back to that. We remember during the financial crisis how whopping of a price tag it was when there was a $700 billion plus.
Yeah.
Remember the TARP package, and that was shocking. That's small compared to the amount that has both passed by Democrats in this Congress, but has been proposed. So deficit spending is piling up, and under President Joe Biden, the national debt has exceeded $30 trillion. That is about $240,000 of debt per taxpayer. So think about that.
It's amazing.
You are saddled with that amount of debt per taxpayer. In the first year, the national debt grew by $2.1 trillion under Joe Biden, and $1.3 trillion of that was the quote-unquote COVID package, but it only included 10% to deal with COVID. So this was the very bloated proposal where they didn't get a single Republican vote. And this is one of the driving factors causing inflation. And then on top of that, they've introduced the Build Back Better, which should be called the Build Back Broke package. Mm-hmm. That would be nearly $4 trillion, the largest spending bill in our nation's history by far, and the largest tax increase. So this is an example of out-of-control spending. To put it in perspective, just looking back in the decades, in 1980, the federal debt to GDP ratio was about 35%. That went up in 2000 to a little over 50%. Right now, it's 129%.
That's amazing.
So this is not a workable. This has impacts not only on every taxpayer, but it has impacts on making sure we are globally competitive in the future. When we're dealing with countries like China, when we're dealing with countries like India, New York and the United States have to get their spending under control, which is why putting forth a balanced budget is so important. And again, Republicans have done that since I've been in office. I've voted for balanced budgets. Democrats have never put on the House floor a budget that comes to balance. And who's paying for it? The hardworking taxpayers and future generations. So we're saddling future generations. I'm talking about my son with this historic amount of debt. Mm-hmm. And it goes back to the basic principle of Congress and the country needs to live by the same laws as the American people. The American people struggle on a weekly and monthly basis to balance their budgets, and they work very hard on it. And it's only gotten harder with inflation this past year. Congress needs to step up, which is why I've been supportive of balancing the budget. I've voted to balance the budget.
Well, I did a little research on you, and I'm happy to see. And I don't know where this comes from. I guess I'll ask you a personal question. You seem to have a soft spot for seniors, supporting seniors, with the Older Americans Act.
Yes.
Where does that come from? Is that something that you've seen, you've lived, or it's just a passion of yours?
It's a passion. Well, first of all, I've gotten to know so many seniors and communities in this country, and I also am very respectful of previous generations. I mean, I think back to my parents' generation where they're getting older, but also my grandparents' generation. And this is a generation, we're talking about the greatest generation who, fought in World War II, the Korean War, and they are passionate members of communities. And it representing the North Country, that's my constituency. As I talked about, I have the highest percentage of seniors. I think I'm number 2 or 3 across the country. The only one that has more seniors are some congressional districts in Florida.
Wow, that's really surprising to me. That's kind of a shock, to be honest with you.
Well, I have, as I said, one of the most aged districts, and what's interesting about it is I was the youngest member when I was first elected. Yeah. So seniors were looking for a new generation of leadership. But the Older Americans Act, that is an important program. It funds Meals on Wheels. Yep. And for a district like mine that's very rural, that's a challenge. Those programs are important for seniors. And particularly during COVID, we got the Older Americans Act done, and I was the Republican lead on that. That was before COVID. Thank goodness that was in place because the Meals on Wheels program had to surge throughout COVID with our seniors, particularly at the beginning when there was not a lot of medical and scientific information out there. We need to make sure that they had access to nutrition and food. So Meals on Wheels was really important. Alzheimer's, making sure that we have cutting-edge treatment and an understanding of challenges for families facing Alzheimer's. That's really important as well. So, there's a lot of partisan issues in Washington. One of my most proud bipartisan results was being the lead Republican to deliver the Older Americans Act, which has really benefited all the seniors' lives in my district. And I give the seniors credit in the North Country. It takes a lot to get through North Country winters, and they are committed to their communities, to their homes, and we need to make sure that we understand how inflation is impacting them
Sure.
in many ways the worst, because they are so much on a balanced budget in many cases.
Well, one of the things that we do at the Retirement Planning Group is we do a lot of estate planning. And I lived it for 8 years. My wife was a caregiver for her mom and dad, so I know the stress and the demand it puts on a family. But I'm also well aware of the Medicaid rules here in New York State and how people can hide assets in order to qualify for Medicaid assistance. What is your position on that as far as our current, because if you talk to any municipality, any county executive, they'll say to you is that the burden of Medicaid is what's keeping our taxes through the roof.
Oh, yes. So the mandates. This is
the
Albany's
mandates.
making decisions about, exactly, Albany's making decisions about these policies, but they're pushing the cost down to the counties, which ultimately is paid for by the taxpayer.
Right.
We're one of the only states in the nation that does that. The Medicaid program in New York State is so mismanaged. If you look, our Medicaid budget is more than the cost of the budget of Florida.
Sure.
Think about that. Florida
Right.
has a higher population. There is so much management. And some of the counties that I represent, over 50% of their budget is for these unfunded mandates,
Yep.
for this Medicaid pushing down onto the counties. And it doesn't have to be that way. Most states in the country don't have any of the burden on the counties because, again, the policymakers making those decisions are in Albany, and they would rather pass the buck. This has real consequences on the taxes, as you point out, the tax increases that we've faced, and just the ridiculously high taxes in New York and at the county level versus other places across the state. The other part of the Medicaid program in New York is it is littered with waste, fraud, and abuse.
Mm-hmm.
There are so much savings to be had to address the waste, fraud, and abuse in that program, and it's going to take real leadership to tackle that at the legislative level, but also at the executive level in Albany. And frankly, the Democrat governors have failed. They've failed abysmally across the board on tackling that issue. If we tackle that, that's going to have huge impacts on being able to lower taxes and allow these counties to, again, not have so much of their budget taken up with by these mandates from Albany.
I mean, if you look at it, you hit the bullseye. It's a huge percentage of the overall budget that's allocated for Medicaid. You take that out of it, you're going to see, Matt, and that's the other thing is that all this money's flowing around. I haven't seen anything funneled from the state of New York down to the taxpayers to reduce our taxes. Where's all this money going?
That's right.
I haven't seen a penny where, we're going to reduce your property taxes one year by 10%.
And they've got more money in New York State than ever before. I mean,
Yep.
One of the examples I'll give you is when the COVID funds for school districts came out, we had to fight tooth and nail to get access to the actual school districts in my district. New York withheld those funds longer than some of the other states across the country. The same thing for rural school districts in particular. It took months, and we worked with our state senators and state assemblymen, worked with my office to publicly call out the governor for hanging on to those funds, and Congress passed them. Those are U.S. taxpayer dollars. The congressional intent was to go straight to the school district, not to the state.
Yeah.
And the fact that it takes a member of Congress to call out the governor to get those funds to the school district, I'm happy to do that, and I know how to deliver results for my district, but it shouldn't have to be that way. And so much of what Democrats right now in Washington have proposed, it goes to the state, but then the state, as we know, they give it to pet projects. Look at the hundreds of millions of dollars that they just passed in the budget that go to the Buffalo Bills Stadium, which Kathy Hochul, I think there are major ethics questions that go to that. We should be thinking about how to lessen the burden on the taxpayers and how to make sure it gets to the local level rather than the bureaucracy in Albany, which has failed, which is bloated, and which is not effective at all. You ask any New Yorker whether they think Albany's doing a good job, the vast majority say no.
Yeah. Well, that I've only got two more questions for you, and I know that you got to go. But, the bottom line is that I guess the one thing that I was thinking about yesterday after I talked to your assistant Palmer, synergy. I'm a big believer in sports. I've loved sports. I played sports, and you work as a team, and you get your result by working together. Is there any synergy at all with Tonko, Schumer, Gillibrand, with the other side of the aisle in order for us to have conversations to deal with these issues? Or are you silos? Are you pretty much a silo where you're on the Republican side of the fence and they're on the Democratic side of the fence for all these issues that we have here in New York State and also on the federal landscape?
So I pride myself in my office. We work with local elected officials of both parties very effectively. Any local elected official, any constituent knows that they can come to my office and they're going to get the best possible service, whether they're Republican, Democrat, independent, unaffiliated. It doesn't matter. I represent them all. And the local officials will tell you that. That's why I earn endorsements from local town supervisors who happen to be Democrats, because we've worked with them. I will tell you at the federal level, it has been frustrating in recent years. There are partisan warriors like Paul Tonko, who a lot of times constituents will call my office because they're not getting the casework, the constituent services that they deserve. And we do the best we can to work with all offices. Some are better than others on working with us. When it comes to Senator Gillibrand and Senator Schumer is so focused right now on being the Democratic majority leader in the United States Senate that he is focused on partisan issues, which is unfortunate. That hurts New Yorkers. And Senator Gillibrand, who actually just moved to the North Country, so I guess she's a constituent now of my district. There are some issues that we work together, but for the most part, they're very much, far left Democrats and not known as bipartisan members. I mean, that's what's interesting, and that's, I know it's been just, I'm sure, frustrating because the media loves to try to peg me, but I have the top 10% most bipartisan record on issues like Older Americans Act, on, what I've done for the veterans community. The media can't get their arms around that, and they attack me day to day, but my constituents know, and that's who I work for. That's not the case for Chuck Schumer, Kirsten Gillibrand, and Paul Tonko. They have some of the most partisan records. And interestingly, if you look at the rating, there are more Republicans who are in that top 10% of Congress who have a very bipartisan record. So I'm a very principled conservative. I'm a principled Republican, but I know how to get things done, and that's what I'm proud of, and that's helped me deliver results in the district. But I will tell you, one-party rule is not working under Democrats, and that's why we're focused on flipping the House.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. My last question to you, and is one that I ask a lot of people. When you're there at night and you've said your prayers and you're staring at the ceiling, what keeps you up at night? What's the greatest fear that you have right now for our country? Is there anything that really is causing you high anxiety? Because there is just so many things going on globally right now that really concern me.
My greatest concern, and this is probably because I sit on the Armed Services Committee and the House Intelligence Committee, is China. Mm-hmm. And I think about how much of a threat a rising China is and is going to continue to be. We need to make sure that our country is the leader in emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, is the leader in quantum computing, all of these really important technologies that are critical for our national defense. Part of that is getting our fiscal house in order, and that's why when you think about the national debt, it's very much a national security issue. But I'm deeply concerned about China. I'm concerned about China's inroads into international organizations like the WHO, the throwing around their weight at the UN, working with developing countries to try to undermine the leadership of the United States and the leadership of a capitalist society, a capitalist economy. That's what keeps me up all night. I think that's going to be the biggest threat to my generation. And I've been very deeply involved with so many policy issues. I've been part of the China task force that put together a number of proposals, whether it's making sure that our manufacturing is strong in the U.S., whether it's promoting trade with our allies like Canada, which is so important in my district specifically because I'm along the border, but it's China. Mm-hmm. That is a huge threat.
Yeah. And if you let me follow up with one real quick one, do you think that
go ahead.
Do you ever think, Congresswoman, that there'll ever be accountability for COVID?
It's, the Republicans are going to do that in the majority. The fact that there hasn't been a single hearing conducted by Democrats on the origins of COVID-19, that is a dereliction of duty. It's really Republicans who have done the oversight work to find out the fact that so much information points to this lab in Wuhan. And remember, the media smeared anyone who dared question that. We now know that that's where all the facts point to. We are committed to having hearings and actually getting the truth for the American people, because if you think of the trillions of costs to the American, economy,
Sure.
but also the lives lost, we need to get to the bottom of that, and there needs to be accountability.
Yep.
China needs to be held accountable, and also the fact that it was Chinese communist propaganda that the WHO put out at the start of COVID and continues to really cover for the Chinese Communist Party, that is unacceptable. There should not be U.S. taxpayer dollars going to those organizations that are fronts for the communist Chinese. The other part is COVID. It's not just internationally and from a perspective of the country, but New York State needs to be held accountable for their mismanagement of COVID. I represent many families who lost loved ones in nursing homes, and that certainly has been brushed under the rug. That's a serious, serious issue, and these people, many of whom lost both parents, both elderly parents, there needs to be a real transparent investigation, and then there need to be policies put into place to make sure that never happens again. One of those that we can tackle at the federal level is making sure that your loved one can visit you in nursing homes, regardless of whether there's a pandemic or not. The fact that there were no loved ones to be able to advocate, I know how important that is for seniors. I know how important that is for my family. You need an advocate when there's a health crisis, and in addition to the neglect on top of the COVID-19, which spread like wildfire through nursing homes because of Andrew Cuomo, there needs to be a federal investigation on that. I'm committed to doing that. That will be one of my top priorities in an oversight capacity of holding New York State accountable for the decisions they made that were against any scientific, any medical advice, and they were against the law according to what the rules from the federal government were. So there's a lot of work that we need to do. And again, New York State was one of the worst states managing COVID. We know that from an economic perspective, but also from a medical perspective. And we all remember the media held up New York State and became obsessed with covering Andrew Cuomo. That's not the reality of the experience of everyday New Yorkers. Everyday New Yorkers understood that it was a disaster in New York.
Yeah. I'll tell you what, all you have to, an explanation point on what you just said, Janice Dean from Fox.
Yeah.
That whole story.
That whole story is tragic. I talked to Janice Dean, but in addition to Janice Dean, why she's been so effective is she's a known sort of personality on TV. Behind Janice Dean are so many people whose names that people may not know, but the stories are horrific. I mean, I'll never forget it. I talked to a constituent who I had never reached out to my office before. His elderly mother passed away in a nursing home. He didn't get to say goodbye. He said she was in her nightgown. They weren't able to take care of her when they laid her to rest. I mean, it was awful. These stories are awful, and these families deserve accountability.
Well, you know what? I'll tell you what. If you haven't lived, I saw a lot of it. We lost, I think, 15 or 16 clients to COVID. Plus, we had, some family members. It was horrific, and I can't say it enough. You seem to have gotten it. You understand how tragic it was. But when you deal with seniors like we do, it was horrible. This whole COVID thing was horrible. Finally, I swear to God, this is the last question. Redistricting. What's going on?
Good question. Very timely question.
Do you even know where to go to campaign?
That's funny you say that, because later today I'm going to Canada Harry, which was in the newly drawn district, but who knows?
Who knows?
It's in the new district.
Hey, maybe
but I committed.
not.
I'm going. I'm going. So here is the update. First of all, this is tied directly to the exodus from New York. So we're losing a congressional seat.
Right.
Just so people make the connection, that means that's one less voice in Washington in the United States Congress because we've lost population. That's point one. Number two, Democrats egregiously gerrymandered these districts. We won this court case at every level, and it's New Yorkers. Every New Yorker benefits from this win. And what's interesting is at this last level, the Court of Appeals, it was 7 Democratic appointed judges.
Right. And
we won the majority. The New York, the voters in New York who challenged this case, we won. based upon the fact that these were not fair districts. They were incumbent protection districts. And we need fair maps, fair lines. So what's going to happen now is by May 20th, there is a special master is the term, which I know is hard to understand, but it's basically a professional that will draw the map under the supervision of the judge, the first judge in Steuben County, and those will be the congressional maps. The state Senate was also thrown out because they were egregiously gerrymandered as well. It is going to be a primary for the congressional races at the end of August. So typically that's the end of June. That's going to shift to the end of August. So we'll have certainty here in the next month. But this is an example of a very gerrymandered state, and that's the problem when you have supermajority Democrat power. They try to protect themselves and hurt the voices of everyday voters. So we're pleased at the win. Every New Yorker should be pleased at the win because it's a win for making sure that every New Yorker has a voice and that we keep communities of interest together.
Well, I can't thank you enough. For you to take the time out of your busy schedule to spend a little over half an hour with us. Hopefully you'll come back sometime in the future and we can talk about some other issues.
I will.
But God bless you and your family, your little baby boy, and you be safe. And I think you're a great American.
Well, thank you, Dave. I'll definitely come back. As I said, I'm a listener. So I'm listening just like everybody else when I drive with my son Sam to visit his grandmother.
All right. Well,
so great to talk with you. I'll come back later this year.
Okay.
Thank you.
God bless. Bye-bye. All right, Congresswoman Stefanik. I couldn't thank her enough for coming on. I think she gave us a lot of good information. It seems like a lot of the issues that we're concerned about as taxpayers, she's well aware of it. The tax liability, what's going on with Medicaid. I want to overemphasize Medicaid, not Medicare. The burden that's shifted to us as the taxpayers in New York State. So hopefully this will stimulate more conversation. We're going to take a break. We come back. We'll do a little bit of a summary of this conversation. But if you have any questions or comments, we'd love to hear from you. Zach is ready. He's ready. You wascally wabbit. At 1-800-TALK, WGY. That's 1-800-825.